Hi everyone. In this bite-sized bit, we're going to talk about errors in our code. We'll discuss how to detect errors, how to find those errors, and how to fix those errors. Let's go ahead and get started. In our previous video, we created a very simple form, and from that form, we created a method attached to the clicking of our submit button event. And that method has an input, process, and output where we collect the student name from the text box, we create a phrase based upon that student's name, and then we output that phrase to a message box on our screen. Errors come in all shapes and sizes in computer code. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. One very simple error is what we would call a syntax error. Well, while we're typing our code, we've typed something that's incorrect. So for example, maybe instead of typing txt student name, I accidentally typed txt student names. When you make a syntax error like the following, you immediately get that red squiggly line that indicates that there's something wrong. You should never run code that has red squiggly lines. If I did try to run this code, I would immediately get a build error. Anytime we get this error, we want to click no, and we want to find the culprit. In this case, there's just one. We can see it in the error messages at the bottom. And if I double click on that error message, it takes me immediately to the location of the error so that I can fix it. In this particular case, it's very easy to remove the S and return to code that has no syntax errors. Syntax errors are easy to see, and they're usually easy to fix. But let's introduce a more insidious error. Maybe when I'm creating my code, I accidentally type LBL student name.txt instead of txt. This won't cause a syntax error. LBL student name exists. If you'll recall, when we created our visual interface for this form, we created a label called student name and we gave it a name. The name, which you can see in the upper panel of the properties window, says LBL student name. We can also see the name of this label in the name property in our list, LBL student name. So in our code, LBL student name.txt is perfectly valid. There's no red squiggly. There's nothing wrong with the syntax of this code. However, when we run this code, it's obviously not going to work the way we intended. If I type Joe Schmo and click submit, the result I get is the student's name is student name : period. And that's definitely not what we were looking for. When something like this happens, it's called a logic error. There's nothing wrong with the syntax of our code, but the code isn't accomplishing its intended objective. So let's talk about a more advanced technique for discovering, finding, and fixing logical errors in our code. And that technique is called breakpoint analysis. Breakpoint analysis is a critical technique for all programmers. If there's nothing else that you get from this class, I hope you'll learn that breakpoint analysis is one of the most valuable tools in your toolbox. Breakpoint analysis is very simple to introduce. In the left-hand side of your visual interface for your code, you can click anywhere in this gray area to introduce a breakpoint. I'm going to click here at the very beginning of my method. This opening brace is the start of my code. I could click a breakpoint on a specific line of code if I wanted to instead, and that would certainly work just as well. These are basically pause points in our code. So when our program gets to a specific point in our code that has a breakpoint, the code will pause, and then we as programmers can examine what's happening at that specific point. We can move through the code one line at a time, or we could restart the code at full speed once we're ready. I'm going to introduce one breakpoint at the very beginning of our button click method, and then I'm going to run my code to see how this actually affects the running of this program. I'm going to type Joe Schmo again, and I'm going to click submit. When I click submit, it causes the trigger event button click to call our btn submit _ click method. And then the very first thing that happens is our breakpoint activates, and our code is now in a paused mode. we can now examine what's going on behind the scenes. And there are a couple of tools that are very useful while we're in breakpoint pause mode. In the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a panel that has 3 tabs. If you're using an older version of Visual Studio, you may not see this first tab, which is called Autos, but you will see Locals and you will see Watch 1. Locals is what we're going to spend most of our time looking at in this class. Locals tells us about information that is currently relevant to the code that we are running. So in this case, things like the sender and the E that are defined in this method that we have not had a chance to talk about yet, and also our internal variables, strStudentName and strMessage. And you can see at the moment, both of those internal variables are equal to null. We haven't used them yet. I'm going to go ahead and move through this code one line at a time. And the way I'm going to do this is by choosing this debug step into option, but you'll notice that it has a shortcut key, which is F11 on your keyboard. So I'm going to hit F11 on my keyboard one time, and you're going to see the cursor, the yellow arrow here, jump to the next line of code and pause again. I haven't run this line of code yet. I'm about to. I'm going to hit F11 one more time, and we will see the results of that line of code that was just run. In this case, at the bottom, you can see that strStudentName is equal to studentName : We picked up the text property from the label and stored it in a new variable called strStudentName. Now you'll notice when I'm moving my cursor over certain parts of my code, I'm getting a prompt that shows me the value of that specific property or variable. So in this case, when I hover over lblStudentName.text, I see that it's equal to studentName : When I hover over strStudentName, you can see that now that I've run that line of code, strStudentName is equal to studentName : In the current line that I'm about to run, strMessage is equal to null. I haven't changed it yet. When I hit F11, you'll see strMessage has changed to the student's name is studentName : The most recent change due to your code running will always be in red in the locals window, so it indicates to you what has most recently changed. At any point during this breakpoint analysis, if you realize you have some code you want to fix, you can stop the running of your code and go and fix the code that isn't working correctly. In this case, I'm going to change this back to txt. I'm going to leave my breakpoint in place and run my code again. When I type a name and click submit and run through this code, we'll see that strStudentName goes from null to Joe Schmo, because this is now working correctly. And our phrase will look correct. And then I'm going to hit F11 one more time, and our message box will show up on the screen exactly the way it's supposed to. I am still in breakpoint mode. When I click OK, my breakpoint is going to come to the very last line of my code, this closing brace. And if I hit 11 one more time, my code is now returning to the visual form, ready for my next action. I won't get a breakpoint again until I click the submit button again, but if I do, the code will start all over, my variables will reset to empty or null, and everything will run just the way it did before. I hope from this short example you recognize the value of breakpoint analysis. Being able to see your code in action and move through your code one line at a time, examining what's happening to the various properties and variables is extremely useful, and I hope that you will use breakpoint analysis to great effect as you move through your coding experience. In many of my future videos, I will be using breakpoint analysis to illustrate other principles. For instance, in the very next video where we explore different data types, I'll be using breakpoint analysis to show how we create different data types for input, process, and output. So breakpoint analysis will be a critical tool, not just for your programming, but for my teaching. That's it for now. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.